Against the brutal backdrop of 1880s Montana, an extraordinary tale of survival and redemption unfolds. Caroline Miller, young and 8 months pregnant, faces certain death when her late husband's family casts her out into a merciless blizzard. As darkness falls and temperatures plummet, she collapses on a desolate road, her hope fading with each labored breath. That's when Wyatt Blackthorne finds her, a wealthy rancher whose own tragic past has left him as cold as the storm around. The reclusive man, known for his losses rather than his mercy, makes a choice that will change both their lives forever. He takes her in, defying the whispers of a judgmental town and his own hardened heart. As Caroline heals under his quiet care, something unexpected begins to bloom between these two wounded souls. But can love truly mend what life has broken? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The gold wedding band caught the last rays of sunset through the Miller mansion's stained glass windows, its inscription already wearing thin after just 2 years. "My heart is yours eternal, Thomas." Caroline Miller traced the words with her fingertip, remembering the day Thomas had slipped it onto her finger with such certainty in his eyes. She had been so young then, barely 20, and he had seemed larger than life, the heir to the Miller cattle empire. That was before the morning sickness, before the quiet joy of feeling their child move within her, before the fever that took him in 3 terrible days. Now, at 8 months pregnant, she stood in what had been their bedroom, packing the few belongings her in-laws had deemed truly hers. The rest, they explained in clipped tones, belonged to the Miller estate. "You have until sundown," Margaret Miller had announced earlier that day, her silver hair pulled into a severe bun, her backbone straight as a fence post. "The child, of course, will be raised here as befits a Miller heir, but you—" She had paused, lips pursed like she'd tasted something bitter. "You were never truly one of us." Caroline's hands trembled as she folded Thomas's old quilted jacket, the one that still held traces of his pipe tobacco scent. She had worn it every night since the funeral, trying to keep some part of him close. But Margaret had made it clear. Anything Thomas had owned stayed with the Millers. The grandfather clock in the hallway struck 4, its deep resonance echoing through the massive house. Only 2 hours of daylight remained, and the clouds gathering over the Montana mountains promised the season's first serious storm. Caroline had watched the weather worsen all afternoon from the bay window, where she and Thomas used to sit, planning their future, dreaming of the family they would build. "I warned Thomas." The voice from the doorway made Caroline start. Augustus Miller, Thomas's father, stood there, watching her with eyes the same shade of brown as his son's had been. "I told him marrying a school teacher's daughter would bring no good to this family. Now look, my only son dead and his child to be raised by strangers." "I'm not a stranger," Caroline whispered, one hand protectively covering her swollen belly. "I'm his wife, the mother of your grandchild." Augustus's laugh held no warmth. "You were a dalliance that went too far. Thomas would have seen that eventually. At least now we can ensure the child is raised properly, with Miller values." Caroline straightened, feeling the baby shift within her. "Thomas loved me. He chose me. Thomas was young and foolish. But the Millers have built this ranch over 3 generations. We will not let it be diminished by—" He gestured dismissively at her simple dress, her unadorned hair. "Common blood." The words stung, but Caroline lifted her chin. She thought of her father, the school teacher who had taught her that true worth lay in character, not coins. "There's nothing common about love, Mr. Miller, or grief." A shadow crossed Augustus's face, gone so quickly she might have imagined it. He turned away, pausing at the door. "The storm's coming fast. I suggest you hurry. Once the sun sets, the gates will be locked, with you on whichever side you've chosen." The threat was clear. Leave now, alone, or stay and lose her child to the Miller's cold embrace. Caroline looked around the room one last time, at the four-poster bed where she had lain beside Thomas, at the cradle Margaret had already ordered, removed to the nursery, at the life she had thought would be hers forever. With shaking hands, she slipped the wedding ring into her pocket. It was all she would take of Thomas's, this one small circle of gold that had sealed their promises. Outside, the wind was rising, carrying the first few flakes of snow. Caroline pulled her worn coat tight around her shoulders, gathered her meager belongings, and walked away from the only security she had ever known into the gathering storm. See, Miller Family Bible lay open on Margaret's desk, its pages worn from generations of births, deaths, and marriages carefully recorded in fading ink. With methodical precision, Margaret drew a thick black line through Caroline's name, erasing her from the family's history as easily as winter erases autumn's last warmth. Outside, the snow was falling faster now, thick flakes dancing in the gathering dark. Caroline stumbled down the long drive, each step taking her further from warmth and shelter. The wind cut through her coat, a spring weight garment never meant for Montana's brutal winters. Her small carpet bag held little more than a change of clothes and the remaining coins from her teaching days. The nearest town was 6 miles away, a journey she had made countless times in Thomas's buggy, laughing at his stories, planning their future. The first mile passed in a blur of memories and bitter wind. Caroline kept one hand pressed against her belly, murmuring soft reassurances to her unborn child. "We'll find shelter, little one. Your papa had friends in town. Surely someone will take pity on us." But even as she spoke the words, doubt crept in like the cold seeping through her boots. The second mile brought the realization that she had lost the main road. The familiar fence lines had vanished behind curtains of white, and the wind had risen to a howl that seemed to come from all directions at once. Caroline's feet were blocks of ice, and her fingers had long since lost all feeling. Still, she pressed on, knowing that to stop was to die. "Stubborn girl." The wind seemed to carry Margaret's voice. "You could have stayed, accepted our terms. The child would have wanted for nothing." Caroline shook her head, sending ice crystals flying from her frozen hair. The Millers would have raised her baby in their image, cold, proud, calculating, just as they had tried to reshape Thomas, to erase the gentle soul she had fallen in love with. The third mile nearly broke her. A contraction seized her body, stealing her breath. Too soon. Far too soon. Caroline fell to her knees in the snow, tears freezing on her cheeks. "Please," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was praying to God or begging her body to hold on. "Please, not here. Not like this." The pain passed, leaving her weaker than before. When she tried to stand, her legs betrayed her. She crawled to what looked like a fence post, using it to pull herself upright. The snow was falling so thickly now that she could barely see 3 feet ahead. Night was coming fast, painting the white world in shades of grey and shadow. In her pocket, Thomas's ring pressed against her numbing flesh. She pulled it out, squinting at the inscription through eyes heavy with exhaustion and frost. "My heart is yours, eternal." A sob caught in her throat. "Oh, Thomas, why did you leave us? Why weren't you strong enough to fight the fever?" The wind snatched her words away, scattering them across the endless white. Another contraction gripped her, and this time when Caroline fell, she couldn't find the strength to rise. She curled around her swollen belly, trying to share what little warmth remained in her body with her child. The snow began to cover her like a burial shroud. Through the howling storm, she thought she heard hoofbeats. Caroline tried to call out, but her voice was as frozen as the rest of her. The sound faded, and with it her last hope. The Millers would win after all. They would find her body with the spring thaw, and her baby, her precious child, would never draw breath. Darkness crept in at the edges of her vision. Caroline thought of her father's small schoolhouse, of the books he had read to her on winter evenings just like this one. "Life," he had told her, "is the most precious gift we have. Fight for it, Caroline. Never let go while there's still breath in your body." but she was so tired. The cold had become almost comfortable now, like sinking into a deep sleep. Her hand still clutched Thomas's ring, the gold now as cold as her skin. As consciousness slipped away, Caroline imagined she saw a light cutting through the storm, heard the crunch of boots in snow. But that was impossible. No one would be out in weather like this. No one would be looking for a woman who had already been erased. The ranch deed hung in its weathered frame above Wyatt Blackthorne's desk. The elaborate script faded but still legible. 2,000 acres of Montana territory, purchased in full by Wyatt and Sarah Blackthorne, Anno Domini 1878. He'd stopped looking at it years ago, just as he'd stopped looking at Sarah's portrait. Some wounds were better left undisturbed. The storm rattled the study's windows with growing fury. Wyatt added another log to the fire, watching as sparks spiraled up the chimney like lost souls. 7 years of winters alone in this house, and still the silence felt wrong. He could remember Sarah's laugh echoing through these rooms, her dreams of filling them with children's voices. Thunder cracked overhead, unusual for a snowstorm. His cattle would be huddled in the lee of the ridge where he'd had his men build. Windbreaks last autumn, good men who knew better than to disturb him once they'd finished their day's work. The isolation suited him now, though there had been a time when the Blackthorne Ranch was known for its hospitality. A harsh gust rattled something loose on the barn roof. Wyatt grimaced, reaching for his heavy coat. No sense letting good timber go to waste, because he was feeling sorry for himself. Sarah would have scolded him for such self-indulgence. The blast of wind that met him at the door nearly knocked him backward. Snow swirled into the entrance hall, a preview of the white hell waiting outside. Wyatt pulled his collar up and forced himself into the storm, one hand trailing along the guide rope he'd strung between house and barn. He was halfway there when his stallion Thunder let out a piercing whinny from inside the barn. The horse was not easily spooked. Wyatt had bred him for steadiness as much as strength. Something had disturbed him. Abandoning the rope, Wyatt pushed through deeper drifts toward the barn door. The wind caught it as he pulled it open, slamming it back against the wall. Thunder was pawing at his stall gate, ears pricked forward, eyes fixed on something beyond Wyatt's shoulder. "Easy, boy," Wyatt murmured, but the horse only grew more agitated. Following Thunder's gaze, Wyatt turned slowly, one hand on his hip where his revolver usually rode. There, a darker shadow against the white world. Something had collapsed against his fence line, already half buried in snow. Probably a wounded deer, or maybe one of his yearlings that had strayed from the herd. Either way, he couldn't leave it to suffer. Wyatt forced his way through thigh-deep snow, the wind trying to steal his breath. As he drew closer, the shape resolved itself into something that stopped his heart for one terrible moment. Not an animal, a woman. She lay curled on her side, her dark hair crusted with ice, one hand clutched to her swollen belly. "Dear God!" The words froze in the air between them. Wyatt dropped to his knees beside her, brushing snow from her face with shaking hands. Her skin was like ice, but when he pressed fingers to her throat, he found a pulse, thready and weak. But then he saw her condition, and his blood ran colder than the storm. She was heavy with child, likely in her final months. What desperate circumstances had driven her out into weather that would kill a strong man, let alone a woman in her state? There was no time for questions. If he didn't get her warm soon, neither she nor her child would survive the night. Wyatt shrugged out of his coat, wrapping it around her frozen form. When he lifted her, she seemed to weigh nothing, as if the storm had already begun to transform her into something as insubstantial as the swirling snow. Thunder was still agitated when Wyatt carried her into the barn. He laid her on a bed of clean straw while he quickly harnessed the horse to his small sledge. The house was only 100 yards away, but in this weather it might as well have been miles. As he worked, his mind raced. The nearest doctor was in town, a good 3 hours. Ride in fair weather. In this storm, it would be suicide to attempt it. He would have to tend to her himself, using what he remembered from Sarah's final illness. Sarah. The thought of her stopped him for a moment. What would she make of this? A strange woman, clearly in desperate trouble, delivered to their doorstep by the storm. He could almost hear her voice. "The Lord works in mysterious ways, my love." Wyatt secured the woman in the sledge, tucking heavy blankets around her still form. As he did, something glinted in the lantern light. A gold ring, clutched so tightly in her frozen fingers that he feared trying to remove it would break them. "Hold on," he whispered, though she was far beyond hearing. "Just hold on a little longer." The storm howled around them as Wyatt led Thunder toward the house, fighting for each step. Behind them, the barn door swung wild, and somewhere in darkness, a wolf howled, a sound so lonely it could have been Wyatt's own heart crying out to the night. Sarah's medical journal lay open on Wyatt's lap, its pages soft with age and use. Her careful handwriting filled each page with remedies learned from frontier wisdom. Wild yarrow for fever, willow bark tea for pain, honey and spruce tips for cough. Every ranch wife must be her own doctor, she had written on the first page. Life is too precious to waste waiting for help to arrive. The woman in his bed hadn't woken in the 12 hours since he'd found her, though her color had improved once he'd got her warm. Wyatt had done what he could, following Sarah's instructions for treating exposure. He'd stripped off her frozen clothes, wrapped her in warmed blankets, and spooned beef broth between her blue-tinged lips. Now, in the grey light of morning, he studied her face. Younger than Sarah had been, but with lines of worry etched around her mouth. Dark hair, features that might have been pretty if they weren't drawn with exhaustion. And that swollen belly, like a prophecy beneath the quilts. She stirred, eyelids fluttering. Wyatt tensed, suddenly conscious of the impropriety of the situation. A strange woman in his home, in his bed under his care. The gossips in town would have a field day with this, if they knew. "Thomas?" Her voice was barely a whisper, rough with cold and fear. "Rest easy," Wyatt said, keeping his voice low. "You're safe." Her eyes opened fully then, revealing irises the color of storm clouds. Fear flashed across her face as she took in her unfamiliar surroundings. She tried to sit up, one hand protectively covering her belly. "Don't move too quickly," Wyatt warned. "You nearly froze to death out there." "The baby," her voice caught on the words, "seems fine. I sent one of my hands for Doc Matthews at first light, but it'll be hours before he can make it through the drifts." Wyatt hesitated, then added, "I'm Wyatt Blackthorne. This is my ranch." She sank back against the pillows, tension still visible in every line of her body. "Caroline Miller," she whispered. Then, as if the name itself exhausted her, she closed her eyes. Miller. Wyatt knew the name. Everyone in 3 counties knew the Millers. Old money, old pride, old cruelty dressed up as tradition. He looked again at Caroline's simple clothes, the worn wedding ring she still clutched even in sleep. There was a story here, but now wasn't the time to press for it. He turned to leave, but her voice stopped him. "Why did you save me?" The question caught him off guard. "What else could I have done?" "Left me." Others did. The words held no bitterness, just a bone-deep weariness that made his chest ache. Wyatt looked down at Sarah's journal, at the careful instructions for healing wounded bodies and spirits. "My wife," he said slowly, "would never have forgiven me if I had." Something shifted in Caroline's eyes, recognition perhaps of the grief in his voice. "She's gone. 7 years now. Fever took her and our unborn child." The silence that followed was heavy with shared understanding. Outside, the storm still raged, but in this room that still held echoes of Sarah's presence, something fragile was taking root. Caroline's hand moved to her belly as another thought seemed to strike her. "I can't pay you," she said. "For your help, for—" "Stop!" Wyatt's voice was gruffer than he'd intended. "This isn't about payment." She studied him for a long moment, as if trying to read the truth in his face. Whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy her, because some of the tension left her shoulders. "There's soup warming on the stove," he he said, standing. "Think you can manage some?" A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "I think I have to try, for the baby's sake." Wyatt nodded, oddly pleased by her determination. At the door, he paused. "The storm's likely to last another day at least. You'll be safe here until it passes. And after?" The question held all the weight of her uncertain future. "We'll figure that out when it comes." It was more of a promise than he'd intended to make, but looking at her, alone, pregnant, clearly running from something, he couldn't bring himself to regret it. In the kitchen, ladling soup into a bowl, Wyatt found himself speaking softly to Sarah's memory. "You'd know what to do, wouldn't you, love? You always did." The only answer was the wind's moan and the crackle of the stove fire. But somehow he felt less alone than he had in years. The attic door creaked open reluctantly, releasing the musty scent of stored memories. Wyatt hadn't been up here since Sarah died, but Caroline needed something to prepare for her child, and he knew exactly where the cradle was. Sarah had insisted on keeping it even after. He pushed the thought away, lifting his lantern higher. There it stood in the corner, draped in a sheet that had once been white. Wyatt's father had carved it from black walnut, a wedding gift meant to whole generations of Blackthorne children. The sheet fell away under his touch, revealing the deep, rich wood, still glowing with years of careful polishing. "Mr. Blackthorne?" Caroline's voice drifted up the attic stairs. She'd been on her feet for 3 days now, moving carefully through his house like a ghost, trying not to disturb the layers of his solitude. "Up here," he called back, running a hand along the cradle's smooth rail. The wood held warmth, as if it had been waiting all these years for another chance. He heard her slow footsteps on the stairs, cautious but steadier than yesterday. When she appeared in the doorway, colour had returned to her cheeks, though shadows still lingered under her eyes. "I was wondering where you'd—" She stopped, seeing the cradle. One hand went to her throat, the other to her belly. "Oh, it needs a cleaning," Wyatt said gruffly, suddenly unsure of his impulse to bring it down. But the wood's sound. Caroline approached slowly, her fingers trailing along the carved headboard where generations of Blackthorns had scratched their initials. "It's beautiful," she whispered, "but surely you don't want— it must hold such memories for you." Wyatt turned away, pretending to check the cradle's rockers. No sense letting it gather dust up here when there's need for it below. A soft touch on his arm startled him. Caroline stood closer than she ever had before, close enough that he could smell the lavender soap Sarah had stored in the linen closet. "Thank you," she said simply. He nodded, not trusting his voice. Together, they managed to maneuver the cradle, down the narrow attic stairs and into the sunny sitting room where Caroline spent her days. The morning light caught the grain of the wood, bringing out depths he'd forgotten existed. "My mother had one similar," Caroline said, settling into Sarah's old rocking chair. "Though not nearly so fine. She used to say a cradle holds more than just babies. It holds all the hopes and dreams of those who rock it." Sarah said something similar. The words slipped out before he could stop them. He didn't talk about Sarah, not to anyone, but Caroline's quiet presence seemed to unlock something in him. She would spend hours up there, planning how she'd decorate the nursery. Caroline's hands moved over her belly in slow circles. "How long were you married?" 5 years. Wyatt found himself sinking into the chair opposite her, the one he'd avoided since Sarah died. "Long enough to build this place together, not long enough for—" He gestured at the cradle. "I had 8 months with Thomas," Caroline said softly. 8 months of marriage, I mean. We'd known each other since childhood, but his parents—" She stopped, pain flickering across her face. "The Millers have a reputation," Wyatt said carefully, watching her reaction. "Yes." Her smile held no humor. "Forgetting what they want, no matter the cost." She looked down at her hands, twisting Thomas's ring. "They wanted their grandchild. They didn't want me." The pieces fell into place. Her condition, the storm, the desperate flight. Anger stirred in Wyatt's chest, an unfamiliar sensation after years of carefully feeling nothing. "They won't find you here," he said, surprising himself with the fierceness in his voice. Caroline looked up sharply. "I can't stay forever. Once the baby comes—" "You can stay as long as you need." Wyatt stood, suddenly restless. "The house is big enough. God knows it could use a woman's touch again. People will talk. Let them." He moved to the window, watching snow fall from the eaves in the warming sun. "I stopped caring what people thought when Sarah died." Behind him, he heard the soft creak of the rocking chair, a sound so domestic it made his throat tight. "Besides," he added, "you'll need help with the little one. Can't manage a newborn alone." The silence that followed was comfortable, filled with the chair's gentle rhythm and the pop of the hearth fire. Finally, Caroline spoke, her voice thick with unshed tears. "I don't know how to thank you." Wyatt turned back to her, seeing not the frightened woman he'd rescued from the storm, but someone stronger, someone beginning to bloom in the warmth of simple kindness. "You already have," he said. "You've brought life back to these rooms." The cradle stood between them, its shadow dancing in the firelight like a promise of things to come. The bundle of letters was tied with a faded blue ribbon tucked away in the drawer of Sarah's writing desk. Caroline hadn't meant to find them. She'd only been looking for a pen to write down the recipes Wyatt's housekeeper had promised to share. But there they were, the paper soft with age and handling, the top envelope addressed in Wyatt's bold hand. "My dearest Sarah." She should have closed the drawer immediately. These weren't her memories to disturb, but something in the careful way they'd been preserved made her pause. The Caroline who had lived in the Miller mansion would never have dared read another's private thoughts, but that Carolyn had died in the storm, and this new one, the one Wyatt had saved, was learning to trust her instincts. "My beloved Sarah," the first letter began, dated 15 years ago. "I saw you again at church today, sitting with your family in the front pew. You wore that blue dress that matches your eyes, and when you sang the hymns, I swear the angels themselves stopped to listen." Caroline sank into the desk chair, drawn into the courtship of a younger, more passionate Wyatt than the quiet man who now shared his breakfast table with her each morning. "I know your father thinks I'm not good enough," another letter read. "Just a rough rancher with big dreams, but I'll build you a palace, Sarah. Every brick, every board will be laid with love. Our children will grow up in rooms filled with laughter." The creak of a floorboard startled her. Wyatt stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. Caroline's hands trembled as she tried to return the letters to their drawer. "I'm so sorry," she began. "I didn't mean to pry." "She kept everyone," Wyatt said quietly, moving into the room. "Even the ones I wrote when we were first courting. When I could barely string 2 words together without making a fool of myself." Rather than anger, his voice held a wistful note that made Caroline's heart ache. He crossed to the desk, gently lifting one of the letters. "I used to ride 10 miles just to leave these at her father's gate. Took me 3 years to convince him I was worthy of her." "You loved her very much," Caroline said softly. "Still do, in my way." He settled into the window seat, the letter open in his weathered hands. Different now, of course. More like a cherished memory than an open wound. Didn't think that would ever happen. Caroline watched him, seeing beneath the quiet strength to the deep wells of feeling he usually kept hidden. "Tell me about her." Wyatt was silent for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then she laughed at everything, even when times were hard, and they were those first years. The house wasn't much more than a cabin then, but Sarah, she'd find joy in the smallest things. First crocuses in spring, way the light hit the mountains at sunset, sound of rain on the roof. "She sounds wonderful." She was. He carefully refolded the letter. "Would have loved having you here, actually. She always said this place needed more life in it. More love." The word hung between them, delicate as a soap bubble. Caroline felt heat rise in her cheeks, remembering passages from the letters where Wyatt had poured out his heart with such raw honesty. "I've been alone too long," Wyatt continued, his voice rougher. Forgot how a house should feel with someone else in it. Someone who understands. He trailed off, but Caroline knew what he meant. She felt it too, the gradual warming of these rooms, the way silence had become comfortable rather than empty, the way her heart quickened when she heard his boots on. The porch in the evening. Sometimes, she said carefully, life gives us second chances we never expected. Wyatt's eyes met hers, and something electric passed between them. Caroline, but whatever he might have said was interrupted by a sharp knock at the front door. They both froze, reality crashing back. No one came to the ranch unannounced, not in this weather unless the Millers, Caroline whispered. Her hand instinctively going to her belly. Wyatt was already on his feet, his expression hardening into the mask she'd first seen when he rescued her. Stay here, he said quietly. Whatever happens, remember what I promised. You're safe here. As he strode from the room, Caroline gathered Sarah's letters with trembling fingers, returning them to their drawer. Help him, she whispered to the ghost of the woman who had inspired such love. Help us both. The Montana Weekly Herald lay folded on Wyatt's desk, its headline stark against the yellowed paper. Miller heir's widow missing. Prominent family offers reward. Below it, a smaller article caught the eye. Blackthorne Ranch stirs gossip. Reclusive rancher takes in mystery woman. The knock at the door hadn't been the Millers after all, just Doc Matthews making his weekly check on Caroline. But the newspaper he'd brought with him carried threats more insidious than any confrontation. Wyatt's jaw tightened as he read the carefully worded implications in the society column. Sources say the young widow in a delicate condition may have suffered a breakdown after her husband's untimely death. The Miller family expresses deep concern for her welfare and that of their unborn grandchild. They're painting me as mad. Caroline's voice from the doorway was steady, though her hands clutched her shawl tight around her shoulders. She'd grown stronger over the past weeks, her face filling out, her eyes brightening. But now, the old fear had returned. Town gossip, Wyatt said, trying to sound dismissive. It'll pass. No, it won't. Caroline moved to stand beside him, close enough that he could smell the bread she'd been baking. You don't know the Millers like I do. They're building their case, piece by piece. First I'm unstable with grief. Next I'm endangering their grandchild. Finally, she touched the paper with trembling fingers. Finally they'll say, I'm living. In sin with a notorious recluse. The last words stung more than Wyatt wanted to admit. Let them talk. This is my land. You're under my protection. Your protection. Caroline's laugh held no humor. That's exactly what they'll use against us. Already the paper hints at impropriety. She wasn't wrong. The article's author had been clever, never making direct accusations, but raising questions that would set every tongue in the territory wagging. Why had the wealthy widow fled her in-laws' care? What really went on behind the walls of Blackthorne Ranch? What sort of man took in a pregnant woman with no chaperone present? I should leave, Caroline whispered, before I bring more trouble to your door. No. The word came out sharper than he'd intended. Wyatt stood, turning to face her. Running is what they want. It would prove their claims about your state of mind. Then what do you suggest? That we continue living like this, feeding the gossip? I've seen how the town women looked at me in church yesterday, the way they whispered behind their fans. Wyatt remembered those looks, the mixture of speculation and judgment. He'd ignored them, as he'd ignored all social niceties since Sarah's death. But Caroline was different. She understood the power of reputation, the way words could wound deeper than any physical blow. We could marry, he said quietly. The words hung in the air between them, unexpected as summer snow. Caroline's eyes widened, her lips parting in surprise. What? It would solve the immediate problem, give you legal protection. The Millers couldn't claim you were... He gestured at the newspaper, unable to voice the implications it contained. You can't be serious, but her voice held more wonder than rejection. I am. Wyatt moved closer, drawn by something he couldn't name. It needn't be. That is, we could keep separate rooms. Nothing would have to change. But you'd have the Blackthorne name, the legal standing that comes with it. A marriage of convenience. Caroline's voice was barely a whisper. At first, perhaps, Wyatt found himself reaching for her hand, surprised by its warmth. But, Caroline, these past weeks, she looked down at their joined hands, then back to his face. We barely know each other. I know enough. He took a deep breath. I know you're strong. Stronger than anyone gives you credit for. I know you sing to yourself when you think no one's listening. I know you've brought light back into rooms that have been dark for 7 years. A tear slid down Caroline's cheek. The Millers will fight it. They'll say you coerced me, that I wasn't in my right mind. Let them try. Wyatt's voice hardened. I've got friends in the territorial court, men who remember what the Millers were before they got rich, men who owe me favors. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and steady. Caroline moved to the window, her hand still in his. You do this? Take on the most powerful family in the territory just to protect me? Wyatt followed her gaze to the white world beyond. I'd do more than that, he said softly, if you'll let me. The newspaper lay forgotten on the desk, its gossip and innuendo powerless against the truth growing between them. Caroline turned. Back to him, her eyes shining with something that looked very much like hope. Yes, she whispered, yes to all of it. The legal notice arrived by private courier, the heavy cream envelope bearing the Miller family's embossed seal. Caroline recognized Augustus Miller's personal stationery. How many times had she watched him pen his imperious letters at his massive mahogany desk? Her hands shook as she broke the seal, Wyatt's solid presence beside her, the only thing keeping her steady. Notice of legal action, the document began, the formal script a slap in the face. In the matter of the estate of Thomas Miller and the custody of his unborn heir, Caroline's voice faltered as she read further. They're claiming I'm mentally unfit, that the shock of Thomas's death and the trauma of my wandering have rendered me incapable of making sound decisions. Wyatt took the paper, his face darkening as he read. They've petitioned for emergency guardianship of both you and the child. They can't do that, Caroline whispered, but the old fear was rising in her throat like bile. I'm a grown woman, Mrs. Miller. Augustus's letter continued below the legal notice, his precise handwriting as cutting as his words. Your recent behavior has given us no choice but to take action to protect our grandchild. Your flight into a blizzard, your subsequent cohabitation with a man of questionable reputation, and now this hasty engagement, all point to a mind unbalanced by grief. Return to us now, submit to proper medical examination and care, and we may be persuaded to keep this unfortunate episode private. The threat was clear. Come back, or be declared insane. Caroline pressed a hand to her belly, feeling the baby move as if sensing her distress. They planned this all along, she realized. From the moment they cast me out, they knew I'd either die in the storm or be forced to seek help that they could use against me. Wyatt's hand found hers, warm and calloused. They didn't count on you finding me. No. Caroline's laugh held a bitter edge. A wealthy recluse with a tragic past. I couldn't have chosen a better villain for their story if I'd tried. I've been called worse. But his voice held concern. They both knew how this would play out in territorial court. The respectable Miller family against the rough rancher with suspicious motives. A sharp pain lanced through Caroline's back, making her gasp. Wyatt's arm was around her instantly, supporting her as she sank into Sarah's old rocking chair. The baby? Just pressure, she assured him, but another pain followed, stronger than before. It's too early, she whispered. 3 weeks at least. Wyatt was already moving, his voice carrying down the hall as he called for Mary, his housekeeper, to fetch Doc Matthews. Caroline tried to focus on her breathing, the way the doctor had taught her, but panic clawed at her chest. The Millers would use this too. Premature labor brought on by stress, proof of her unfitness. Listen to me. Wyatt knelt before her, taking both her hands in his. Nothing else matters right now. Not the Millers, not their threats, not even our plans. Just you and the little one, you hear? She nodded, clinging to his steady gaze as another contraction built. "I'm scared, Wyatt. I know." His thumb traced circles on her palm, grounding her. "But you're stronger than they know. Stronger than anyone I've ever met. How can you be so sure?" "Because," he said simply, "you've survived everything they've thrown at you. And you've done more than survive. You've found a way to hope again, to love." The word hung between them, more honest than any they'd spoken since his proposal. Caroline saw in his eyes what she'd been seeing for weeks but had been afraid to name. Not just protection or convenience, but real feeling, deep and true. "I do love you," she whispered, then gasped as another contraction gripped her. "I need you to know that in case none of that." His voice was rough with emotion. "You and this baby are going to be fine. And when you're strong again, we're going to fight the Millers with everything we have, together." Outside, horses' hooves pounded up the drive. Doc Matthews arriving, she prayed, and not more Miller family machinations. Wyatt pressed a kiss to her knuckles before rising. "Together," Caroline repeated, watching him move to the window. The legal notice lay forgotten on the floor, its threats meaningless in the face of more immediate concerns. Her body was trying to tell her something, and for once she was glad of the distraction from her fears. The baby would come when it chose, Miller threats or no. And perhaps that was answer enough to their legal maneuverings, life itself defying. Their carefully laid plans. Sheriff James Mackenzie's official report lay unfinished on his desk, the ink still wet. Town meeting minutes. February 12th, 1885. Regarding the matter of Carolyn Miller and the Blackthorne Ranch situation. He'd never been much for paperwork, preferring to let actions speak louder than words. But tonight's events demanded documentation, if only to protect all parties involved. The town hall's pot-bellied stove had barely cut the evening chill as citizens packed the building, drawn as much by curiosity as civic duty. Caroline's absence, due to her precarious condition, had only fueled speculation. Doc Matthews had insisted she remain in bed, with Mary keeping constant watch, while Wyatt rode in to face the Millers alone. "Order!" Mackenzie's voice cut through the murmuring crowd as Augustus Miller rose to speak. "This meeting will maintain proper decorum." Augustus adjusted his silk cravat, every inch the wealthy patriarch. "My fellow citizens," he began, his voice carrying to the rafters, "we gather tonight not in anger, but in concern. A young widow, grieving and confused, has fallen under unfortunate influence." Wyatt sat quietly in the back row, his face unreadable. Mackenzie had known him since they were boys, had watched him withdraw into himself after Sarah's death, but tonight something was different. There was a fire in his old friend's eyes that he hadn't seen in years. "The Miller family," Augustus continued, "seeks only to protect our own. Our grandchild, our son's last legacy, must be raised properly, with all the advantages. The voice came from an unexpected quarter. Martha Jensen, who ran the general store, stood despite her husband's attempts to quiet her. "Like casting out a pregnant woman in a blizzard?" A murmur ran through the crowd. Augustus's face darkened. "You don't understand the circumstances." "Oh, but we do." Martha's normally gentle voice held steel. "My Thomas drove past your gates that night, Augustus Miller. Saw your men turn away every wagon that came asking after her. Called it family. A business, they did." More voices joined in, years of resentment toward the Millers' high-handed ways finally finding outlet. Mackenzie watched Augustus's facade crack slightly, saw Margaret Miller's knuckles whiten around her silk fan. "The law," Augustus thundered, "gives grandparents rights." "The law," Wyatt's quiet voice cut through the chaos like a knife, "also recognizes marriage." Every head turned. Wyatt stood, and Mackenzie noticed how the townsfolk made way for him, not out of fear, but respect. Here was a man who'd helped half their farms survive the drought of '82, who'd never foreclosed on a debt, who'd kept his dignity through devastating loss. Caroline Miller has agreed to be my wife, Wyatt continued, his voice steady. She does so of her own free will, in sound mind, witnessed by Doc Matthews and Sheriff Mackenzie himself. Augustus's laugh held no humor. A convenient claim, given her current residence at your ranch. Tell me, Mr. Blackthorne, how long did you wait after finding her half frozen before proposing this arrangement? The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Mackenzie's hand moved instinctively to his gun belt, but Wyatt's response held no anger, only quiet certainty. I waited long enough to know her strength, he said. Her courage, her ability to love despite everything that's been done to her. Ask yourselves, he turned to address the crowd, who here has shown more concern for Caroline's welfare? Those who cast her out or those who took her in? Pretty words. Margaret Miller spoke for the first time, her voice acid. But they don't change the fact that you're holding our grandchild's mother in virtual captivity. Am I? Wyatt's smile held no warmth. Sheriff, would you do me the honor of reading the telegram you received from Judge Harrison this afternoon? Mackenzie pulled the paper from his vest pocket, grateful now for Wyatt's foresight in having him witness the marriage. Agreement. By order of the Territorial Court, he read clearly, no action regarding the custody or guardianship of Caroline Miller or her unborn child may be taken without a full hearing. Furthermore, her right to marry of her own free will is hereby affirmed. The Millers' faces turned purple with rage, but the tide of public opinion had turned. Mackenzie watched as neighbors who had whispered about scandal now nodded in approval of Wyatt's legal maneuvering. Even Reverend Stone, who had initially expressed concern about the propriety of the situation, seemed satisfied by the judge's intervention. This meeting, Mackenzie declared, reaching for his report, is adjourned, though I believe Martha Jensen has something to add. Martha stood again, smoothing her apron. Just that there's a wedding quilt being sewn at my store. Any ladies who'd like to contribute a square are welcome. Even you, Mrs. Miller, she added with pointed sweetness, should you choose to remember what Christian charity truly means. As the crowd dispersed into the snowy night, Mackenzie watched Wyatt mount his horse, eager to return to Caroline. The sheriff's report would note that the meeting ended peacefully, but it wouldn't record the look of quiet triumph in his old friend's eyes, or the way the town had chosen love over power, humanity over wealth. Some things, Mackenzie reflected, were better left to memory than official record. The telegraph clattered urgently in Doc Matthews' office. Labor progressing. Stop complications likely. Stop need assistance immediately. Stop Blackthorne Ranch. Stop. His hands shook as he quickly penned his response to Mary, Wyatt's housekeeper, who had run 3 miles through deepening snow to send the message. The storm that had brought Caroline to Wyatt's door 2 months ago had returned with a vengeance, as if nature itself were marking the circle of their story. Doc Matthews gathered his medical bags, remembering another snowy night 7 years ago when he'd failed to save Sarah and her child. He couldn't fail again. At the ranch, Caroline's labor pains came in waves that left her gasping. Wyatt hadn't left her side since returning from the town meeting, his large hand engulfing hers with each contraction. The fire roared in the bedroom hearth, but she couldn't stop shaking. Too early, she whispered between pains. The baby's too early. Plenty of early babies grow up strong, Mary soothed, laying fresh towels on the bedside table. But her eyes met Wyatt's with worry. The contractions were coming too fast, too hard for a first birth. Tell me about the meeting, Caroline demanded, trying to focus on anything but her fear. Tell me what happened with the Millers. Wyatt's thumb traced circles on her palm, the gesture now as familiar as breathing. The town stood with us. Martha Jensen's organizing a wedding quilt. Caroline managed a weak smile, then tensed as another pain built. And the judge's order holds firm. The Millers can't touch you or the baby without a full hearing. He didn't mention Augustus Miller's parting threat. This isn't over, Blackthorne, not by a long way. Thunder cracked overhead, and Caroline clutched Wyatt's hand harder. Sarah, she gasped. Sarah died in a storm like this. This isn't that night. Wyatt's voice was fierce. You're stronger than Sarah was. The baby's stronger. How can you know? Because you survived everything they threw at you. Because... He broke off as hoofbeats pounded in the yard. Mary rushed to the window. Doc Matthews and, oh Lord, the Miller's carriage. Caroline's next contraction came with terror mixed in. Don't let them in, please, Wyatt, don't let them. Nobody's taking you anywhere. He pressed a kiss to her forehead. Mary, help Doc up. Tell Joshua to keep the Millers in the parlor. Doc Matthews burst in, shaking snow from his coat. His experienced eyes took in Caroline's condition, and his face grew grave. How far apart are the pains? 3 minutes, Mary reported. Waters. Broke an hour ago. The doctor quickly washed his hands, his movements efficient but careful. Baby's presenting wrong, he announced after a brief examination. We'll need to turn it. Caroline's cry of pain was echoed by raised voices from below. Augustus Miller's commanding tone carried through the floorboards. That's my grandchild being born up there. You can't keep us out. Like hell I can't, came Joshua's steady reply. The ranch foreman had been with Wyatt since the beginning, as loyal as family. Doc Matthews ignored the commotion, focusing entirely on Caroline. Mrs. Miller. Caroline. This will hurt, but we must act quickly. The child's life depends on it. Wyatt's face went pale, but his voice remained steady. Tell us what to do. The next hours passed in a blur of pain and fear. Caroline felt herself slipping between past and present. Her mother's stories of difficult births, Thomas's dreams of their child, the Miller's cold rejection, Wyatt's unwavering support. Through it all, his hand anchored her to reality. His voice a lifeline in the storm. Stay with me, he murmured. Stay with me, love. Below, the confrontation continued. Margaret Miller's sharp tones cut through Caroline's haze. If anything happens to that baby, Blackthorne, we'll hold you responsible. But it was another voice that reached Caroline's fading consciousness. Sarah's voice, from the medical journal. She'd left behind. Life comes on its own terms, in its own time. Our job is simply to love fiercely enough to light the way. Turn now, Doc Matthews commanded. Push, Caroline. Push with everything you have. She did, gathering all her strength, all her love, all her defiance of those who had tried to break her. Wyatt's hand tightened on hers, and in that moment she felt Sarah's presence like a warm wind, guiding them all through the storm. Thunder shook the house to its foundations, and Caroline pushed one final time, her cry of effort rising above the tempest. In the sudden silence that followed, a new sound filled the room, thin and angry, and perfectly wonderfully alive. The baby had arrived, turning their world upside down once again. The wooden cross stood sentinel in the corner of Wyatt's bedroom, its simple lines carved by his own hands 7 years ago. Sarah Blackthorne and child read the inscription, worn smooth by time and touching. He'd never been able to bring himself to move it, even when Caroline took up residence in the room. Now, as he watched her nurse his son, no, their son, the cross seemed less an endpoint and more a bridge between past and future. He's strong, Doc Matthews said softly, packing away his instruments. The elderly physician looked exhausted, but pleased. Good color, healthy cry. Never would have guessed. He was early. Caroline barely seemed to hear, lost in wonder as she counted tiny fingers and toes. The baby's shock of dark hair was already beginning to curl, just like his father's, his first father's, Thomas's son, but also, somehow, Wyatt's. Love. They were learning, had room to grow in unexpected directions. You should rest, Wyatt murmured, perched carefully on the bed's edge. He couldn't stop staring at them, his miracle family born of tragedy and storm. A commotion from downstairs shattered the peaceful moment. We demand to see our grandchild, Margaret Miller's voice carried clearly, followed by Joshua's firm refusal. Caroline clutched the baby closer, her face draining of what little color she'd regained. Wyatt, they won't get past that door, he promised. But the cross caught his eye again, reminding him how quickly happiness could slip away. Doc Matthews straightened, his professional manner returning. "As the attending physician, I cannot permit any visitors. The mother needs rest, and the child—" A new voice joined the fray below, one that sent ice through Wyatt's veins. "This warrant gives us full right to inspect the premises and ensure the welfare of both mother and child." Judge Wilson's pompous tone carried clearly. "The Millers have expressed grave concerns about the conditions here. They must have ridden for the judge the moment they left town," Wyatt growled. "The Millers had friends in every courthouse in the territory. Judge Harrison's protective order wouldn't mean much if Wilson chose to override it." Caroline's eyes filled with tears of exhaustion and fear. "They'll never stop, will they? They'll hound us until—" "No." Wyatt's voice was quiet, but held steel. He crossed to the corner and lifted Sarah's cross from its place of honor. "I've lost one family to forces beyond my control. I won't lose another." The baby whimpered, sensing his mother's distress. Caroline soothed him automatically, her eyes never leaving Wyatt. "What are you going to do?" He ran his fingers over the carved inscription, remembering the days of grief that had followed, the loneliness that had nearly broken him. But Sarah had taught him about strength in adversity, about love that transcends loss. And Caroline had taught him about love that heals, that builds something new from broken pieces. "Doc," he said, carefully hanging the cross in its new place above the bed, "would you be willing to testify that moving either Caroline or the child right now would endanger their health?" The old physician's eyes twinkled. "Already wrote it. In my official report, dating it 2 hours ago, before Judge Wilson's arrival." Footsteps sounded on the stairs. Wyatt squared his shoulders. "Caroline, do you trust me?" "With my life," she whispered. "With his life." The answer seemed to fill him with new purpose. He strode to the door just as knocking began, but instead of opening it, he called out clearly, "Judge Wilson, before you proceed, you should know that Caroline and I completed our marriage vows 10 minutes ago, with Doc Matthews as witness. The baby's birth certificate will show him born to Caroline and Wyatt Blackthorne, all perfectly legal and binding." Silence fell heavy as snow. Then Augustus Miller's voice, tight with fury, "You can't do that." "Already done." Wyatt's hand found the cross, drawing strength from its rough wood. "Any attempt to separate a child from his legal parents will be met with the full force of territorial law. I may be a recluse, Judge Wilson, but I still have friends in high places, friends who remember what Montana was like before the Millers bought their way to power." More silence, broken only by the baby's soft noises and the storm's dying winds. Finally, Judge Wilson spoke, his tone notably less certain. Perhaps we should review the situation in the morning. After all, Doc Matthews' medical opinion carries significant weight." "The morning will change nothing," Wyatt said firmly, "except that I'll have had time to send telegraphs to every newspaper in the territory about how the Millers tried to separate a newborn from his mother." The threat hung in the air like wood smoke. Caroline watched, barely breathing, as shadows moved away from the door, followed by the heavy tread of retreating footsteps. When the house fell quiet again, Wyatt returned to the bedside. Caroline reached for his hand, guiding it to the sleeping baby's cheek. "Welcome to fatherhood," she whispered, her smile bright with tears and triumph. The wooden cross caught the lamplight, its shadow falling across them like a blessing. Sarah would have understood, Wyatt thought. She would have rejoiced in this moment of love, conquering fear, of new life rising from loss. Outside, the storm finally broke, revealing stars as bright and countless as possibilities. The birth certificate lay drying on Wyatt's desk, the official territorial seal gleaming at its bottom. In Doc Matthews' careful handwriting, it proclaimed, "Thomas Wyatt Blackthorne, born February 13th, 1885, to Wyatt and Caroline Blackthorne," a simple document that represented so much more than mere facts. It was their shield, their future, their declaration of family forged in both blood and choice. Thomas Wyatt, Caroline murmured from her place in Sarah's old rocking chair, the baby nestled against her chest. "Are you sure about the name? About claiming him so completely as yours?" Wyatt looked up from where he was signing his name as father. "He'll know about both his fathers as he grows, the man who gave him life, and the one who chooses him every day." He paused, pen hovering. "Unless you'd prefer—" "No," Caroline said quickly. "No, it's perfect. Thomas for his birth father, Wyatt for the man who saved us both." Her eyes filled with tears. "I just never expected, after everything the Millers took from me, to be given so much in return." Doc Matthews cleared his throat, clearly moved as he added his own signature as witness. "Speaking of the Millers, my sources say they left for Helena this morning. Seems they've suddenly remembered urgent business with their lawyers." "Let them go," Wyatt said, his voice steady. "They'll find every judge in the territory has already received notice of our marriage and the birth. Amazing how fast news travels when Martha Jensen takes an interest in spreading it." Caroline smiled, remembering how the shopkeeper's wife had arrived at dawn with a basket of fresh bread and fierce determination. Already the house was filling with evidence of the town's support: quilts, preserved fruits, tiny handmade garments. Even the ranch hands had caught the mood, working with extra vigor, as if to prove the Blackthorne Ranch was a fitting place for a new mother and child. "Still," Doc Matthews cautioned, "they won't give up easily. Old Augustus Miller didn't build his empire by accepting defeat." "No," Wyatt agreed, "but he built it in a different Montana. Times are changing." He crossed to Caroline, laying one hand gently on the baby's dark head. "And we're not alone anymore." As if in response, young Thomas stirred, revealing eyes that seemed to shift between his birth father's brown and Wyatt's gray. Caroline caught her breath at the sight. This perfect blending of past and present, of loss and love found again. "Doc," Wyatt said quietly, "would you mind giving us a moment?" The old physician gathered his things, tucking the precious birth certificate into his leather case for filing at the territorial office. At the door, he paused. "You know, I've delivered hundreds of babies over the years, seen all kinds of families come together or fall apart. But what you've built here," he shook his head, smiling. "Sarah would be proud, Wyatt, of both of you." After he left, silence filled the room, not the heavy silence of Wyatt's years of grief, but the peaceful quiet of a family finding its rhythm. Outside, the morning sun glinted off new snow, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf called to its mate. "I've been thinking," Caroline said softly, "about Sarah's medical journal, about her dream of helping others." Wyatt knelt beside the rocking chair, his eyes questioning. "The territory needs a proper midwife, someone trained, someone who can reach the outlying farms and ranches." She touched the baby's cheek. "I was a teacher before. Perhaps I could learn. Study with Doc Matthews. Continue what Sarah started." Wyatt was quiet for so long that Caroline began to worry she'd overstepped, but when he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "She'd like that. God, Caroline, she'd love that. And you? What do you think?" He gathered them both in his arms, careful of the baby's small form. "I think you're remarkable. I think I fall more in love with you every day. And I think young Thomas here is going to grow up knowing exactly what strength looks like." Caroline leaned into his embrace, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady beat of his heart. Through the window, she could see the distant mountains where the storm had first driven her to his door. They looked different now, not threatening, but protective, like sentinels guarding their valley. "We'll need to expand the house," she mused. "If I'm to see patience, already planning on it." Wyatt's smile held all the promise of spring. "Got plenty of room to grow in every way that matters." Thomas sighed in his sleep, one tiny hand clutching his mother's shawl. In that moment, Caroline knew the birth certificate wasn't just a document of fact, but a testament to love's ability to rebuild, recreate, and redeem. Judge Harrison's gavel struck with quiet authority, its sound echoing through the Helena courthouse like a church bell's final toll. "Let the record show," he intoned, that this court finds no merit in the Miller family's petition for guardianship. Furthermore, the marriage of Caroline and Wyatt Blackthorne is deemed legal and binding, with all rights and protections therein extending to their son, Thomas Wyatt Blackthorne. Caroline's hand tightened on Wyatt's arm as Augustus Miller surged to his feet, his face mottled with rage. "Your Honor, this is an outrage. That child is a Miller by blood and a Blackthorne by law and choice." Judge Harrison cut in, his steel-grey eyes sharp beneath heavy brows. "Unless you wish to challenge the very foundations of territorial marriage law, Mr. Miller, I suggest you accept this ruling with what grace you can muster." The courtroom buzzed with whispers. Half the town had made the journey to Helena, filling the benches in silent support. Martha Jensen sat directly behind Caroline, while Doc Matthews had taken his place at the witness stand, his testimony about the birth and marriage still hanging in the air like gun smoke. Margaret Miller's voice cut through the murmurs. "Cold as mountain frost, you've stolen our grandson's birthright. His proper place in society, his proper place," Caroline found herself speaking, her voice stronger than she'd ever heard it, "is with people who love him for himself, not for what he represents." She turned to face her former in-laws, Thomas, sleeping peacefully in her arms. "You cast me out when I was Thomas's widow. Now I stand here as Wyatt's wife, and you have no power over either of us." "Well said." Judge Harrison nodded, lifting his gavel again. "This court also orders the Miller family to cease all attempts at contact or interference with the Blackthorne family under penalty of law. Do I make myself clear?" Augustus's lawyers huddled around him, whispering urgently. Caroline could see. The moment he realized defeat was absolute, his shoulders sagged, and for just a second he looked his age. "We could appeal," Margaret began, but Augustus silenced her with a sharp gesture. "Enough," he said heavily. "We've lost more than a legal battle here. We've lost the respect of our neighbors, the goodwill of the territory." He turned to Caroline, and for the first time she saw something like recognition in his eyes. "You're more a Miller than I ever gave you credit for. That same steel spine Thomas admired." "I'm not a Miller," Caroline said quietly. "I'm a Blackthorne. And so is your grandson." The baby stirred then, his eyes opening to reveal that mysterious blend of brown and grey. Augustus took an involuntary step forward, seeing perhaps for the first time how the child carried echoes of both his fathers. Thomas's curling hair, Wyatt's strong brow. He cleared his throat. "You'll tell him about Thomas every day," Wyatt answered, his arm steady around Caroline's waist. "He'll know about his birth father's kindness, his love of books, his way with horses, and he'll know that somewhere he has grandparents who loved his father very much." Tears sparkled in Margaret's eyes, the first genuine emotion Caroline had ever seen from her, but before she could speak, Augustus turned away, guiding his wife toward the door. At the threshold, he paused. Perhaps when the boy is older. "We'll send word," Caroline offered, surprising herself. "Let you know how he grows." The Millers departed without another word, their footsteps fading down the marble hallway. Judge Harrison's gavel struck one final time, sealing their victory, not just in law, but in mercy. Outside the courthouse, spring sunshine warmed the steps where their friends waited. Martha Jensen was the first to embrace Caroline, careful of the baby. "Knew you had it in you, girl. Knew it the moment I saw you. Standing up to them in town hall." Doc Matthews clapped Wyatt on the shoulder. "Sarah would say this calls for celebration." "Already planned," Joshua called from the crowd. "Whole town's gathering at the ranch tomorrow. Might even convince our recluse here to smile." Wyatt did. Smile then, looking at his family. The wife he'd found in a storm, the son he'd chosen to love, the community that had become part of their healing. The same sun that had once illuminated his losses now painted their future in shades of gold. "Take us home," Caroline whispered, and Wyatt nodded, knowing she meant more than just the ranch. Home was what they'd built together, what they'd fought for and won. Home was the truth ringing in Judge Harrison's gavel, in their friend's joy, in their son's peaceful breathing. Home was love chosen, day by day, storm by storm, until it grew, stronger than blood or law or loss itself. The marriage license caught the morning light streaming through the church windows, its fresh ink glistening like promises made real. Though they had already spoken their vows in private during that stormy night of Thomas's birth, this public celebration meant something different. Not just a shield against the Millers' claims, but a declaration of the love that had grown between them, as steady and true as the changing seasons. "By the power vested in me," Reverend Stone's voice carried through the packed church, "I now pronounce you husband and wife." Again. A ripple of warm laughter moved through the congregation. "And may God bless this union that began in charity and blossomed into love." Caroline felt Wyatt's hand tighten around hers as he leaned in to kiss her, gentle but sure. Thomas, now 3 months old, slept peacefully in Martha Jensen's arms in the front pew, his dark curls catching the same light that blessed their license. In that moment, Caroline understood what Sarah had written about love being a kind of medicine. It had healed them all, stitch by stitch, day by day, looking out at their gathered friends, at the community that had become family. Caroline saw not just their past struggles, but their future's infinite possibilities. And in Wyatt's eyes she saw home. The family portrait hung in pride of place above the sitting-room mantel, captured by a traveling photographer who'd been amazed to find such natural grace in a frontier family. There stood Wyatt, his usual reserve softened by obvious pride, one hand resting on Caroline's shoulder. She sat in Sarah's restored rocking chair, Thomas balanced on her lap, his year-old face bright with mischief and health. But it was what the photograph didn't show that meant the most. The journey that had brought them here, the love that had transformed 3 wounded souls into something whole and new. "He's got Thomas's smile," Caroline said softly, watching. Their son toddled across the room on increasingly steady legs. But those eyes are pure Blackthorne now. Indeed, the baby's eyes had settled into Wyatt's clear grey, as if choosing his second father in this too. "And your spirit," Wyatt added, coming to stand behind her. The sitting room had changed over the past year, filling with signs of their shared life. Medical texts sharing shelf space with Sarah's journals, toys scattered among the serious furniture, the wedding quilt draped across the settee. Through the window, they could see the new wing taking shape, where Caroline would soon begin seeing patients, carrying on Sarah's dream of bringing healing to the valley. "Martha says the Millers received a letter," Caroline mentioned, watching Wyatt's reflection in the portrait's glass. They had sent a daguerreotype of Thomas on his first birthday, along with a carefully worded note. "She thinks Margaret cried." Wyatt's arm slipped around her waist, solid and sure. "You did right by them, love, more than they did by you. I learned mercy from you," she said simply. "You took in a desperate stranger and showed her what real family means." Thomas pulled himself up using his father's leg, demanding attention in the way of all beloved children. Wyatt swung him up, and Caroline's heart swelled at how natural they looked together. The man who had lost everything, the child who had gained a second chance, their love-bridging blood and choice. The portrait caught them all in perfect stillness, but their life was anything but static. It moved forward with each sunrise, each small victory, each moment of grace discovered in ordinary days. They were writing their own story now, one that began in storm and ended in sunshine, proving that sometimes the finest families were the ones chosen by heart. The new ranch sign swung gently in the autumn breeze. Blackthorne and Miller Ranch and Medical Station, its fresh paint gleaming against weathered wood. Below, in smaller letters, "All welcome." Caroline traced the ampersand with her fingers, marveling at how a simple mark could contain so much meaning. The joining of families, the bridging of past and present, the union of different dreams into one shared vision. The valley had changed. In the 2 years since she'd first arrived in a storm, The ranch's new medical wing now served families from 3 counties, its rooms filled with the same healing wisdom that Sarah had recorded in her journal. Caroline had added her own notes, alongside Sarah's remedies, blending formal medical training with frontier knowledge. Doc Matthews called it a miracle, how she could calm a colicky baby or ease a difficult birth with equal skill. But Caroline knew the real miracle was in the way love could transform suffering into purpose. From her vantage point on the front porch, she could see Wyatt teaching Thomas to ride his first pony, their matching grey eyes squinting against the golden light. Their son had inherited his first father's gift with horses and his second father's quiet strength, along with a generous heart that seemed uniquely his own. Just yesterday, he'd solemnly shared his toys with a patient's child, announcing that Mama says healing isn't just for bodies. The ranch itself had grown too, not just in size, but in spirit. Where once Wyatt had shut himself away in grief, now the great room regularly filled with neighbors seeking help or offering it. The kitchen always had a pot of coffee ready for travelers, and the barn had been expanded to shelter horses belonging to families staying for longer treatments. Even the Millers had begun to thaw, sending Thomas small gifts on his birthday and Christmas. Their last letter had carried a note of pride in how the ranch had become a beacon of hope in the territory. Your father, Augustus had written, would be pleased to see his son's name living on in such good works. Martha Jensen appeared at the gate, her market basket full of fresh bread and gossip. Town council meeting went well, she called out, climbing the porch steps. They've approved the new road that'll make it easier for folks to reach you in winter. Caroline smiled, remembering another winter, another journey. Hard to believe how much has changed. Love changes everything, Martha said wisely, setting down her basket. Speaking of which, Mary told me you've been feeling peculiar in the mornings lately. Caroline's hand drifted to her middle, where the first subtle signs of new life were making themselves known. She hadn't told Wyatt yet, wanting to be sure. Some changes are still coming, she said softly, Martha's eyes filled with happy tears. Oh, my dear, that man won't know what hit him. As if summoned by their conversation, Wyatt appeared with Thomas on his shoulders, both of them dusty and laughing from their riding lesson. He caught Caroline's eye and smiled, that special smile that still made her heart skip after all this time. The sign creaked gently overhead, its shadow falling across the porch like a blessing. Caroline thought of Sarah's cross, now hanging in Thomas's room, watching over his dreams. She thought of the marriage license framed in their bedroom, the family portrait above the mantel, all the markers of their journey, from strangers to beloved. Family. But it was this sign that seemed to say it best. 2 names joined together, offering welcome and healing to all who came seeking shelter from their own storms. Love, Caroline had learned, was like that. It grew best when shared, multiplied, when given away, and always found its way home. Caroline's memoir lay open on her desk, its pages filled with 5 years of memories, triumphs, and quiet revelations. Love's Second Storm, she'd titled it, though Martha insisted she should call it Healing Hearts when it went to the territorial printer. But Caroline knew her title spoke the truest truth, how love could come again, different but no less deep, like spring storms that renewed the earth. Mama, Sarah Grace's voice carried from the garden, where she played under her brothers. Watchful eye. At 3, Thomas had taken to his role as big brother with the same gentle sovereignty he brought to everything, teaching his 18-month-old sister the names of flowers and birds with infinite patience. Caroline watched them through the window of what had once been Sarah's writing room, now her own sanctuary. The leather-bound volume before her contained not just her story, but all their stories, Sarah's wisdom living on through the medical station, Thomas Miller's legacy in his son's curling hair and love of horses, Wyatt's transformation from grieving recluse to beloved patriarch of their expanding community. Still writing? Wyatt's voice was soft behind her. He smelled of leather and sunshine, having just returned from helping a neighbor's mare birth twin. Foals. Just finished, actually. Caroline leaned back against him, drawing strength from his solid presence. I've been thinking about that night in the storm, how close I came to giving up. If you hadn't found me, if you hadn't been strong enough to hold on, he corrected gently. We found each other, love. That's what matters. Through the window, they watched Thomas lift his sister to smell a late-blooming rose, supporting her weight as naturally as they all supported each other. The new ranch sign creaked in the autumn wind, its message of welcome, drawing more visitors each month. Just yesterday, a young widow had arrived seeking shelter and healing, her eyes holding the same desperate hope Caroline had once carried. The Millers are coming for Thomas's birthday next week, Caroline mentioned, touching the latest letter from Margaret. Augustus says he's finally ready to share some of Thomas's childhood stories. Wyatt's arms tightened around her. Time heals. When we let it, speaking of healing, his hand drifted to her middle, where their third child was just beginning to make its presence known. Doc Matthews confirmed it yesterday. Caroline smiled. He says I'm becoming a better midwife than him. Sarah would be proud of all of it, Wyatt said softly. The medical station, the children, the way you've helped heal not just bodies, but hearts. Caroline closed her memoir, running her fingers over its leather cover. Inside, she documented every step of their journey, from that desperate night, in the storm, to this moment of quiet joy. She'd written of loss and love, of chosen family and second chances, of how healing could come in many forms. I think, she said carefully, she sent me to you. That night when I was ready to give up, I felt something, a presence, a warmth. Wyatt was quiet for a long moment, watching their children play in the garden Sarah had planted. Wouldn't surprise me, he finally said. She always did have a way of knowing what people needed. The memoir's final words seemed to glow in the late afternoon light. Love, I've learned, is not a finite resource to be hoarded or divided. It grows, like Sarah's healing herbs, in the most unexpected places. It weathers storms and seasons, puts down roots, and reaches for the sky. And sometimes, if we're very blessed, it gives us second chances to bloom in gardens others planted, to continue stories others began, to find home in hearts that have known both loss and joy. For love, in the end, is less about possession than participation in each other's healing, in each other's growth, in each other's dreams of what family can mean. Outside, Thomas's laugh mingled with his sister's, carried on the same wind that had once brought their mother to this door. The sound echoed through the valley like a benediction, a promise, a reminder that even the fiercest storms could lead to the most beautiful beginnings.